When three men bury a wooden box deep in the forest under the cover of night, they think their darkest secrets are hidden forever. What they don't realize is that someone is watching. Driven by curiosity and dread, a young man unearths the box, only to be shocked by what he discovers inside. What follows is a gripping story of survival, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe that one act of courage can change everything. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Elijah's footsteps echoed faintly along the empty road, the gravel crunching beneath his worn boots. It was late, and the familiar chill of night crept into his bones, but the silence soothed him after a grueling shift at the factory. 12 hours of sweat, dust, and machines. He welcomed the quiet. He adjusted his bag over his shoulder and cut through the back roads like he always did. The shortcut saved him 20 minutes, a precious slice of time when his body screamed for rest. The faint glow of the moon barely lit the narrow path, but Elijah knew the way by heart. The turn past the oak tree, the uneven patch of dirt just before the clearing. Tonight, though, something felt off. The low hum of an engine broke the stillness, snapping Elijah out of his daze. He paused, ears straining up ahead. Faint beams of headlights sliced through the trees. Someone was out here. Elijah ducked, instinctively slipping off the path and into the underbrush. The last thing he wanted was trouble. Too many stories of people like him ending up on the wrong side of it. From his hidden spot, he could see the faint outline of a van, its doors ajar, idling on the edge of a clearing. Voices rough, hurried, and low. Elijah squinted through the branches. The moon hung high enough to throw long, sharp shadows across the clearing. Two figures were bent over a hole in the ground, dirt flying as they dug with frantic urgency. Another man stood nearby, pacing, his silhouette sharp in the glow of the headlights. Keep moving, one of the diggers barked, his voice carrying just enough for Elijah to hear. Elijah's pulse quickened. He crouched to lower his breath. Shallow. The men were working fast, too fast for anything good. What are they burying? He whispered to himself, his voice lost in the night air. The men grunted with effort, the shovels biting into the earth with quick, sharp thuds. Finally, they stopped. The pacing man gave a clipped order Elijah couldn't make out, and the other two heaved something heavy, a large wooden box, into the hole. The detail of impact sent a shiver through Elijah. Elijah couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away. What was in that box? Why did they need to bury it so fast and so deep? The men covered the box with dirt, their movements mechanical and brutal, as if they wanted the earth to forget it had ever been disturbed. One of them cursed under his breath, slamming the shovel into the mound of soil as the others looked on. Hurry up, the pacing man snapped, his voice edged with anger. We need to go. Elijah pressed a hand to his chest to steady his breathing as the men gathered their tools, shoving them into the van. The headlights swept across the clearing as the vehicle turned, the engine revving before it disappeared down the trail. The night fell silent again, but Elijah felt anything but calm. His heart hammered in his chest and sweat bead on his brow. Despite the cold, the clearing sat still. Now the only sign of disturbance, a fresh mound of dirt where the box had been buried. He knew he should leave it alone. This wasn't his business. Getting involved in something like this was dangerous, but his feet refused to move, his curiosity rooting him in place. What did they bury? He whispered again, this time like a question he couldn't ignore. Slowly, carefully, Elijah stepped out from the brush. The clearing felt larger now, like it was watching him, daring him to move forward. He approached the disturbed patch of earth, his hands trembling as he dropped to his knees. This is stupid, Elijah, he muttered, but his hands were already working, clawing at the loose dirt. The soil was soft, easy to move, and he worked fast. Despite his exhaustion, his arms ached, but something pushed him to keep going. Minutes passed. He hit wood. The box, Elijah's breathing turned ragged as he wiped the dirt away from its surface. It was large and roughly built, the wood scratched and splintered. There were no markings, nothing to tell them what it was for, only its grim, unnatural presence. Hands shaking, Elijah searched for a way to open it. A loose edge caught his attention. He hooked his fingers beneath it and heaved the lid, resisted at first, Groaning against his effort before it finally snapped open, Elijah fell back as the lid crashed to the side, his breath freezing in his chest. Inside the box lay a young woman, unconscious, bound at the wrists and ankles. Her skin was. "This is stupid, Elijah," he muttered, but his hands were already working, clawing at the loose dirt. The soil was soft, easy to move, and he worked fast. Despite his exhaustion, his arms ached, but something pushed him to keep going. Minutes passed. He hit wood. The box, Elijah's breathing turned ragged as he wiped the dirt away from its surface. It was large and roughly built, the wood scratched and splintered. There were no markings, nothing to tell him what it was for, only its grim, unnatural presence. Hands shaking, Elijah searched for a way to open it. A loose edge caught his attention. He hooked his fingers beneath it and heaved. The lid resisted at first, groaning against his effort before it finally snapped open. Elijah fell back as the lid crashed to the side, his breath freezing in his chest. Inside the box lay a young woman, unconscious, bound at the wrists and ankles. Her skin was pale, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Oh my God," Elijah breathed. He scrambled forward, his heart racing. She wasn't moving. For a terrifying moment, Elijah thought he was too late, but then her chest rose faint and shallow. She was alive. "Hey," Elijah said, his voice hoarse. "Hey, can you hear me?" She didn't respond. Elijah glanced around, panic clawing at him. The men could come back. He had no idea who she was, but leaving her here wasn't an option. "Come on, Elijah," he muttered, trying to steady himself. Think. He quickly untied the ropes, cutting into her wrists and ankles, grimacing at the deep marks they left behind. She was lighter than he expected, but his arms still strained as he lifted her out of the box. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing barely audible. Elijah glanced back at the clearing one last time, the shadows swallowing the box and the disturbed earth. Whatever this was, it was far from over. "Hold on," he murmured to the woman, shifting her weight as he stumbled toward the trail. His apartment wasn't far, just a 10-minute walk, but it felt like miles with the weight of this night pressing on him. Every sound made him jump. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. He kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting the headlights to return, the men to drag him down and finish what they'd started. Finally, Elijah reached the edge of town, his tiny apartment building looming like a beacon. He pushed through the front door, his arms aching as he carried the woman inside. Gently, he laid her on the old couch, her face pale against the worn fabric. "What did I just get myself into?" he whispered, staring at the unconscious woman outside. The night stretched on, silent and watchful. Elijah crouched beside the couch, his hands hovering nervously as he stared at the woman he'd just carried in. She lay still, her pale skin stark against the worn brown fabric, her chest barely rising and falling. The rope burns around her wrists and ankles looked angry and raw, and a faint bruise bloomed on her temple. "Who would do such a thing to a harmless woman?" he whispered, his voice tight. He reached for a clean rag and a small basin of lukewarm water from the kitchen. Kneeling back beside her, Elijah carefully wiped the dirt and sweat from her face, wincing at how fragile she seemed under the layer of grime. "You're lucky I found you," he muttered to himself. He worked gently, dabbing at the cuts on her wrists, washing away the dried blood, all the while stealing glances at her face, hoping for some sign she was waking. Each shallow breath of hers gave him a glimmer of hope. "Who are you?" he murmured. Though he didn't expect an answer, his small, threadbare apartment felt stifling. The single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling cast sharp shadows on the peeling walls. He glanced at the front door, locked, and then out the window. The street was quiet, but unease good at him. The men who buried her might still be looking for her, and for him. He sat back on his heels, his fingers trembling. "Think, Elijah, think," he muttered. Hospitals were out of the question. A young man showing up at midnight with a bound and bruised woman. They take one look at him and call the cops. "I need you to wake up," Elijah whispered. "Please." Do you think Elijah did the right thing by digging up the box and taking Camille home, and instead of calling the authorities? Could his decision put them both in even greater danger? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're eager to see how this story unfolds, don't forget to like this video and keep watching to find out hours past and exhaustion. tugged at Elijah's eyelids. He sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the television, the volume low. The woman hadn't stirred, though her breathing had steadied. Outside, the city was sleeping. The TV flickered as the news anchor's monotone voice drifted into the room. Ongoing investigation into the suspicious death of businessman Daniel Harlow, who was found murdered earlier this week. Elijah's head snapped up, his attention riveted. The screen showed a photo of a sharp-looking man in a suit, his expression frozen in a confident smile. The anchor's words barely registered in Elijah's ears. Murdered. Something prickled at the back of his mind, a dark connection that wouldn't quite form. The report cut to a new segment in other news. Authorities continue to search for Camille Hayes, the 25-year-old daughter of prominent businessman William Hayes. Miss Hayes was last seen leaving a gala 3 nights ago, and her family is offering a substantial reward for any information leading to her return. A photograph flashed on the screen. Her photograph. Elijah's blood ran cold. "That's you," he whispered, turning to look at the woman still unconscious on his couch. Her face on the screen, framed in bright blonde hair and a dazzling smile, was now smudged with dirt and bruises. Elijah's mind raced. Camille Hayes. He'd heard the name before. Her father's company owned half the businesses in town, wealthy, powerful, and missing. His hands gripped the armrest as panic rose in his chest. "This is bad," he murmured, running a hand down his face. "This is real bad. What if they thought he had something to do with it?" He could already picture the headlines: "Factory worker kidnaps Hayes." He needed answers, but right now he just needed her to wake up. The room was silent except for the low hum of the TV. Elijah sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, trying to figure out what to do next. A soft sound, a sharp intake of breath, snapped him back to attention. He looked up. The woman was moving, her eyes fluttered open. Unfocused at first, she blinked rapidly, confusion flickering across her face. Her breaths turned shallow and quick. Hey, it's okay," Elijah said quickly, raising his hands in a pleading gesture. She flinched at the sound of his voice, scrambling weakly against the couch cushions. Her arms trembled, too weak to push herself up, but panic was written all over her face, where her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Elijah said, keeping his voice soft. I found you in a box. You were." He hesitated, not sure how much to say. "You were hurt, but you're safe now. I brought you here." "Who are you?" she choked out, eyes darting wildly around the room. "Elijah," he said quickly. "My name's Elijah. Look, I don't want to hurt you. I swear." Her gaze locked onto him, her chest rising and falling unevenly as tears welled in her eyes. "The box," she whispered, her voice breaking. Elijah's heart sank. "Yeah," he said gently. I dug you out. I saw the men burying you, and I couldn't just." Her hands flew to her face, covering her mouth as sobs escaped her. "I was in the dark," she gasped between breaths. "I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe." Elijah's chest tightened. He crouched a few feet away, giving her space, but trying to ground her. "You're out now," he said softly. "Whoever did that to you, they're gone. You're okay." Camille dropped her hands, her red-rimmed eyes locking onto Elijah's. She started, her voice shaking. "They were going to kill me." Elijah didn't know what to say to that. He wanted to comfort her, but what could he say? He couldn't deny it, not after what he'd seen. Camille's gaze darted to the door, then back to Elijah. "Why am I here? Why didn't you take me to a hospital?" Elijah hesitated. "I wanted to," he said honestly, "but you're all over the news, and the way you looked, I didn't know how it would look. I was scared they'd blame me." Camille's breathing slowed, and something in her expression softened as she stared at him. She saw it then, the worry in his eyes, the exhaustion on his face. "He wasn't lying, thank you," she whispered. Elijah looked up, startled. "For what?" "For not leaving me there." For a moment they sat in silence. The weight of what had happened hung in the air, unspoken, but felt by both of them. Finally, Elijah stood, rubbing his hands together nervously. "You should rest," he said quietly. "You've been through a lot." Camille sank back into the couch, staring at the ceiling as tears slid down her cheeks. Elijah turned off the TV and sat back on his bed, his mind still racing. Whoever had buried her wasn't going to let her escape that easily. He could feel it in his bones. The morning light crept weakly through the blinds, bathing the room in muted grays. Elijah sat on the edge of his chair, his knee bouncing as he watched Camille sip water from an old chipped mug. She was pale, her fingers trembling, but her eyes held a clarity he hadn't seen the night before. "How are you feeling?" Elijah asked quietly. Camille didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted across the room at the faded wallpaper, the tiny kitchen, and finally at Elijah, her expression unreadable, alive. She murmured, her voice raw. Elijah nodded. "That's something right." Camille took another slow sip before setting the mug on the table. "They were going to kill me," she said suddenly, her voice sharper this time. "I remember now." Elijah sat straighter. "What do you mean? What happened to you?" Camille's brows furrowed as she stared down at her hands, her fingers twisting together anxiously. I was at a gala. It was for my father's company. I left early. Too many people, too much noise." Her eyes narrowed as if focusing on the memory brought it closer. "When I got to my car, I saw them, two men. They were waiting for me." Elijah's jaw clenched. "They grabbed you?" She nodded slowly. "One of them, he put something over my mouth. I tried to fight, but everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in some kind of basement. I could hear them talking, arguing about what." Camille's face tensed. "I don't know exactly, but I heard one of them say it was her fault that I saw too much." Elijah's throat went dry. "Saw what?" She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. "A murder." Elijah stared at her, stunned into silence. The air between them thickened with the weight of her words. "A murder," he repeated slowly, as if saying it out loud might make it less real. Camille nodded, gripping her knees like they were her lifeline. "It's coming back in pieces," she admitted, her voice saying, "I don't know where I was, some office or warehouse, but I saw them kill him. I saw a man on the floor, blood everywhere. There was shouting, and then they saw me." Elijah dragged a hand over his face, his mind spinning. "You said you were at your dad's gala." "Soku." Camille swallowed hard, her gaze far away as the pieces clicked into place. "Daniel Harlow," she said quietly. Elijah froze. "Wait, Harlow? The businessman, the one they said was murdered?" She nodded again, and Elijah shot to his feet, pacing the small room. "I saw it on the news," he muttered. "They found him 2 days ago. The cops were calling it suspicious, but they didn't say nothing about witnesses because they didn't think there were any." Camille whispered. Elijah stopped and turned to face her, his expression grave. "You saw it happen. That's why they took you. That's why." He trailed off, unwilling to say the rest. "They buried me," Camille finished for him, her voice trembling. The words hung in the air like poison. Elijah sat down heavily, his hands clasped between his knees as he tried to process what she was telling him. He'd thought finding her in that box was the worst part, but this was bigger than anything he'd imagined. "You remember any of their faces?" he asked, trying to stay focused. "No," Camille said with frustration. "It was dark, and everything happened so fast. But I heard a name." Elijah's eyes snapped to hers. "What name?" "Marcus." The name landed like a stone in Elijah's chest. "Marcus," he repeated quietly, his mind churning. "That mean anything to you?" Camille's lips pressed into a thin line. "It could," she admitted reluctantly. "My stepbrother's name is Marcus." "But no," she shook her head as if trying to dispel the thought. "It couldn't be him." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Camille's hesitation told him everything. "I don't know," she said finally. "I just know Marcus and I don't get along, but I can't see him doing something like this." Elijah exhaled slowly. "Well, someone named Marcus was involved, and if you're right, they buried you to keep you quiet." Camille shivered, pulling her knees to her chest. "And now you're involved too," she whispered. The words hit Elijah harder than he'd expected. He sat back in his chair, the reality of his situation sinking in. She was right. Whoever these men were, they wouldn't just stop looking for her, and now they'd be looking for him too. "Maybe you should have left me there," Camille said suddenly, her voice bitter. Elijah snapped his head up. "Don't say that you don't know what you're dealing with," she shot back, her eyes flaring with fear and anger. "These people are dangerous. You should have walked away." Elijah leaned forward, his voice steady. "I couldn't walk away. I saw what they did to you. You think I could just let you die out there?" Camille looked away, her expression softening. Silence settled between them, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Elijah stood, shoving his hands into his pockets and pacing the room again. "You think it's your stepbrother?" he asked after a moment. Camille hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know. Marcus is complicated. My father remarried when I was little, and Marcus always resented me, But murder, she scoffed weakly. I can't wrap my head around that. Elijah turned to her, his gaze steady. Whoever it is, they're not going to stop looking for you or for me. Camille hugged herself tighter, her expression conflicted. I didn't ask you to save me, and I didn't do it for it. Thank you, Elijah said firmly. I did it because it was the right thing to do, but we can't sit here and wait for them to come back. Camille's eyes met his wary but searching. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to figure this out, Elijah replied. We need a plan. You can't go home, and I'm not about to let those men find you again. Camille studied him, a flicker of trust breaking through the fear. Why are you helping me? Elijah hesitated, searching for the right words. Because no one else did, he said quietly, and you didn't deserve this. For the first time since she woke up, Camille's expression softened into something that looked like gratitude. She nodded faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay. Elijah exhaled, relief washing through him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The morning sun filtered weakly through the window blinds. As Elijah pulled back the curtain, his fingers curling around the edge of the fabric, his gut twisted. Across the street, parked under the shade of a dying oak, sat an unfamiliar black sedan with tinted windows. He narrowed his eyes. That's the third time this morning, he muttered under his breath. Camille, perched nervously at the small kitchen table, looked up from the bowl of cereal Elijah had prepared for her. What? Elijah turned toward her, forcing his expression into something calmer than he felt. Nothing. Stay here. All right. I'll be back, she frowned, hugging her knees to her chest as he slipped on his jacket. Where are you going? Just to take a look, Elijah replied, his voice low and reassuring. Camille's eyes darted to the window. You think it's them, don't you? Elijah hesitated, then nodded once. I don't know who else it could be. They know you're alive. Camille's face paled as her gaze dropped to a table. Elijah turned and left the apartment carefully, shutting the door behind him. Outside, the early morning air was crisp, though Elijah felt none of it. His focus was razor sharp as he walked toward the street, pretending to check his phone. He could feel their eyes on him from the car, like heat boring into his back. The engine suddenly revved. The sedan jerked forward and pulled away, its tires skidding slightly against the asphalt. Elijah stood frozen, his heart hammering as the car disappeared around the corner. He spun on his heel and hurried back upstairs, his thoughts racing. When he opened the door, Camille was waiting. What happened? They're watching us, Elijah said grimly, shrugging off his jacket. I don't know what they're planning, but they know you're here. You stay away from the window. All right. Camille swallowed hard and nodded. What are we going to do? Figure something out, Elijah replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But for now, we don't leave this apartment. The hours passed like molasses. Slow and heavy, the two of them sat in Elijah's cramped living room, Camille on the couch, knees drawn up, and Elijah on the floor with his back against the wall. The silence had stretched too long, growing heavier with each passing minute. Finally, Camille broke it. You live here alone? Elijah glanced up at her. Yeah, been on my own since I was 17. She stared at him, surprised. 17? Yeah. Elijah's voice was flat but not unkind. My parents' past car accident. Camille blinked, her expression softening. I'm sorry. Elijah shrugged. It is what it is. Life doesn't slow down for nobody. You just keep moving. Camille tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. That's awful. It's just life, Elijah said. I dropped out of school and started working factories, repairs, whatever I could find. Camille bit her lip. I've never worked a day in my life. Elijah's brow furrowed as he looked at her. Must be nice. She shook her head. It's not what you think. My father's company has been my entire life. He worked so much I barely knew him. My stepbrother Marcus. She hesitated, trailing off. I was alone in a house that didn't feel like mine. Elijah's gaze softened. All that money, and you still felt alone? Camille nodded faintly. You can have everything and still have nothing. The two sat in silence again, but this time it felt different, less cold, more understanding. Finally, Elijah sighed. Well, you ain't alone now. We're going to figure this out. Camille glanced at him and managed a small, fragile smile. I believe you. That night, Elijah lay awake on the thin mattress of his bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. He could hear Camille shifting restlessly on the couch in the next room. Sleep wasn't coming for either of them. Then a noise. Elijah froze. It was faint but unmistakable, the creak of floorboards Outside the apartment door, he shot upright, his heart pounding as adrenaline flooded his veins. In an instant, he was on his feet, moving silently across the floor toward the living room. Camille sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" she whispered. "Quiet." Elijah grabbed a rusty wrench from the kitchen drawer and motioned for her to stay low. A shadow shifted outside the window. The doorknob jiggled. Then came a sharp knock. Once, twice. "Elijah," a gruff voice called. Muffled through the door. "Open up." Elijah's grip tightened on the wrench. "Who's there?" There was no answer. Instead, the door shuddered violently as someone kicked it. Camille flinched, pressing herself back against the couch as Elijah moved closer to the entrance. "Get away from the door," Elijah yelled, his voice ringing through the apartment. Another kick. The wood groaned under the pressure, and Elijah knew it wouldn't hold. His eyes darted to Camille. "The fire is escape," he hissed. "Go now." "What about you?" Camille whispered frantically. "Go." She scrambled toward the window as Elijah braced himself. The door splintered open, and two men rushed in. Their faces obscured by hoods. Elijah swung the wrench hard, catching the first man in the ribs. The man stumbled back with a grunt. The second lunged at Elijah, tackling him to the ground. Elijah's head slammed against the floor, sending sparks across his vision, but he fought back, landing a hard punch to the man's face. "Camille," he yelled, his voice hoarse. "Run." Camille was already halfway down the fire escape, her breath ragged as she descended the creaking ladder behind her. The apartment rattled with sounds of struggle, grunts, crashes, and the dull thud of fists connecting. Moments later, Elijah staggered through the window. Blood smeared across his cheek. "Let's go." They hit the alley, running the street. Lights buzzed overhead as they sprinted through the dark, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. Elijah grabbed Camille's arm, pulling her along as headlights flared behind them. "They're still following," Camille cried, glancing back. Elijah's pulse thundered in his ears. "We got to lose them." They darted around a corner and down a narrow alley, shadows swallowing them whole. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, the sounds of the car faded into the distance. "We can't stay here," Elijah said between breaths. Camille nodded, clutching her sides. "Where do we go?" Elijah looked at her, determination etched into his bruised face. "The city. Will figure it out from there together." They hurried down the sidewalk, their steps fast but quiet. The bus station was small and nearly empty, the ticket clerk half asleep behind the glass window. Elijah fished a few crumpled bills from his pocket, enough for 2 one-way tickets to the city. The bus rumbled softly beneath them as it pulled out of the station, its headlights slicing through the darkened streets. Elijah leaned his head back against the seat, the vibrations of the engine a faint comfort after everything that had happened. Camille sat next to him, silent, her hands tightly gripping the strap of her jacket. She stared out the window, her reflection barely visible in the glass. And after a long moment, she turned to Elijah. "Do you think we lost them?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of all her fears. Elijah exhaled slowly, glancing around the nearly empty bus. A few passengers sat scattered throughout, heads down, lost in their own worlds outside. The dark city blurred past them. "Yeah," he said, keeping his voice steady. "We're good. They don't know where we're going." Unbeknownst to them, the black sedan lurked just a few streets away, its occupants watching and waiting. The motel room was dim and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. Elijah sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes scanning the parking lot through a slit in the curtains. Camille was curled in the corner of the room, knees pulled tight to her chest, exhaustion weighing her down. "This place is a dump," she muttered quietly, her voice thin. "It's the kind of dump where no one asks questions." Elijah replied, lowering the curtain. "We just need a few hours. Once it's light, we move again." Camille sighed, rubbing her temples. "How much longer can we run?" Elijah didn't answer, though her words hung heavy in the room. The faint rumble of an engine outside snapped his attention back to the window. He moved closer, heart racing, as a black SUV crept into the lot, its headlights dimmed. "Camille," he said quietly, "get up." "What? Get up now?" Camille saw the look in his eyes and scrambled to her feet. Elijah grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the back door, whispering, "Stay behind me and don't make a sound." A loud bang echoed through the room as the front door splintered, kicked in with brutal force. Camille gasped, stumbling as Elijah shoved her forward. 2 men burst into the room, their heavy boots pounding against the wooden floor. "Go!" Elijah shouted, pushing Camille toward the alley door, he turned back to block the men, grabbing a rusted chair and swinging it into the first intruder. The man staggered, cursing loudly, but the second one tackled Elijah, slamming him into the wall. Elijah's head snapped back, stars flashing in his vision as fists rained down on him. "Run, Camille," he managed to choke out, his voice ragged. Camille hesitated for a split second, terror etched into her face before bolting through the back exit. Elijah fought to break free, landing a desperate punch to his attacker's ribs. He scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his mouth, but it was too late. Through the doorway, he saw Camille being dragged toward the SUV. One man threw her into the back seat, slamming the door shut as the tires screeched against the pavement. No, Elijah stumbled forward, but the other man tackled him again, pinning him to the ground. Elijah's fists flailed weakly, his strength fading fast. The sound of the SUV speeding off roared in his ears as